Tips for Building a Successful HACCP Plan, presented by Dr. Bob Strong. Dr. Bob is our senior consultant and industry expert in the world of food safety. He is quite a wealth of information. I won't go through all of your CV points, Dr. Bob, but he's got a wealth of information in the food industry, working with all sizes and shapes of food safety organizations. He's one of our lead trainers as well in a number of different areas. I'm very, very pleased to welcome you today, Dr. Bob. So with that, I'm going to hand you control of the presentation and let you get started.
All right, well, thanks very much. I will share my screen with you. I'm waiting to get a prompt to do that. So hang on a minute, sorry, got a technical issue here. Didn't get a share the screen prompt. Here it is now.
There you are.
Got it. Thank you. All right, so let me bring it up to a full screen and say again, welcome to all of you. You've seen that one. What is the purpose of today's complimentary webinar? It is trying to help you if you're having any difficulties in knowing how to start your HACCP plan, how to make your HACCP plan effective, how you're going to do that hazard analysis to make sure that you cover all the hazards that could be associated with the products that you make. Where can I get that information from? That's a question that we get quite often. How do I determine the severity and probability? Because every hazard is not going to have the same effect on you or the same probability. Once I've determined what my hazards are, then what am I going to do to either prevent, eliminate, or control? So we're going to talk a little about that. And how can I get help from my suppliers? Because sometimes my suppliers may be able to do things that I can't do. We'll finish that off with what works and what does not work well, and we'll then get into questions and answer. But in order to determine what audience we have today, Holly's going to conduct a little poll right now to get a feel for where you are.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Dr. Bob. So which area do you feel is the most challenging in your HACCP plan? So let me launch here. I'll read through the responses, give you some time to select the response most appropriate for you. So perhaps it's conducting that hazard analysis on your supply chain, determining the critical control points, maintaining your documentation, or maintaining engagement with top management. We'll leave the poll open for about 30 seconds, give folks a chance to respond. What do you anticipate, Dr. Bob? What would you say is the most challenging for most folks?
I would think conducting a hazard analysis, because if you don't know what the hazards are that you're faced with, it's difficult to move forward to taking care of those hazards.
Yeah, we're certainly trending in that direction. We'll just give it a few more seconds, and I'll close and share the results. That's great. Thanks, everyone. So let me close and share here. So unsurprisingly, to your point, Dr. Bob, 42% say conducting that hazard analysis. Pretty evenly split to the bottom three, though.
All right. Well, that's what I thought you would be, and that's why I hoped you'll find this helpful, because what I wanted to be talking to you about is how are you going to do that hazard analysis, and then follow it up with what are you going to do once you've determined what your hazards are. Because if you don't do your hazard analysis correct, then you're not going to address the hazards that could be coming into your plant with your ingredients, could be coming from your employees working in your plants, or could be coming from the environment in your plant. So therefore, the FDA is now starting to require you to address your foreseeable hazards. So how do I determine my foreseeable hazards? Where can I get help doing this? Well, obviously, the first thing we have to understand is what is a foreseeable hazard. So the FDA and the new GMPs, which have gone into effect for most of you. So remember, large companies, it was 2016. Smaller companies, it was 2017. And for some of you, you may have still till September of this year, but all of you need to be getting there. So what is a foreseeable hazard? It's a biological, chemical, and then the FDA added radiological or physical hazard that is known to be or has the potential to be associated with the facility or the food. So it's something that you have evidence could be coming into your plant, could be in your plant, could finish up being in your finished product. Well, the FDA has even given us more help, and this is what's good about the new GMPs and the new training materials that the FDA is putting out. They are helping us now, giving us advice on foreseeable hazards. So I'm not sure how many of you got on the preventive control for human foods, but if you haven't, I would suggest that you go to that class because it will help you answer what are foreseeable hazards. But it isn't a replacement for HACCP. So again, I'm going to encourage you, if you haven't been to HACCP, that you go to HACCP as well. The two complement each other, but neither of them replaces the other. If you want to know whether hazards associated with your employees, that's covered under the food code. And that normally is only applied to restaurants and retailers, but the FDA has now said this is a good source for those human health hazards, which I'll talk about in a minute. USDA has also helped us. They've listed the 7 most common pathogens associated with meat and poultry. And we also have got information on what hazards that are leading to the cause of recalls. So we're getting guidance on what you should be considering. So if you look at preventive controls for human foods, and I'm not going to go through all these, but this information is available to you, and you will get a copy of these slides later. These are the common vegetative bacteria according to the FDA. Now you may say, well, do all those apply to me, and where would I find them? That's what we'll talk about in a minute. The answer is no, they won't all apply to you. And they've got spore formers listed there as well. And so when you say, where can I get this information from? Some of it is available just on the FDA websites. The FDA also in that potential, the protective thing for human foods, also lists common sources of where you would find these bacteria. Again, the point is not to go through this line by line, but here you are. Here's some common foods, some common raw materials that you would be buying. And the FDA is saying to you, these are the potential biological hazards with these type of ingredients. So when you're doing your hazard analysis, it would seem amiss if you didn't include these in your hazard analysis, because the FDA is saying to you, you should. And then you have to determine what you're going to do about them. When you think about the human health ones, which are in the food code, these are the 5. 3 of them are bacteria, 2 of them are viruses, and the state of California has added a parasite. Again, would these be the type of hazards that could possibly be with your employees? Yes. Are these the things you should be concerned about? Yes. Should these be in your hazard analysis? Yes. Now, I'm not going ahead and saying they should become critical control points, human health, but it certainly should be in your hazard analysis that you're recognizing that this could be a concern, and then you control it with a prerequisite program. You say, well, what are the 7 pathogens associated with meat and poultry according to the USDA? Here's the 7. Again, you say, well, we don't handle meat and poultry, so I wouldn't suspect that you would put these into your hazard analysis. But if you do handle meat and poultry, even if it's only 4 to 5% of a product that you make, then these again would be the 7 that you would consider, and then you have to justify leaving them out of your food safety plan, your HACCP plan. And that's where we've got a little bit of a difference. The FDA talks about a food safety plan. The USDA and GFSI talk about HACCP plans. They're similar. They relate to each other. So you say, well, what other hazards? Chemicals. What are they? Number 1 chemical hazards? Pesticides, if the product's coming from outside the United States. USDA and the FDA say pesticides isn't a big issue inside the United States. So it depends on where you're buying some of your maybe produce from. Allergens is obviously the number 1 cause of recall. So if you're into allergens and you haven't listed allergens as a potential hazard in your hazard analysis, then you have to say, why not? And then the question is, how many allergens do you have? And then we have to talk a little later about labeling, etc. There's a big concern about heavy metals. And you say, what is a heavy metal? Mercury, lead, arsenic, cadmium, copper, etc. Where would I find that? We can talk about that a little later, but these are concerns that are coming in with raw materials. On this page, these are things you can't remove. We go back to the biological hazards. If you've got a heat step, you can get rid of them. But when you start talking about chemical hazards, there's no ability for you to get rid of these things. So therefore, they're going to be in your products, and you need to address that. We can talk about physical hazards. And you say, well, what are physical hazards? Anything in there that's going to cause a harm to the consumer. Now, maybe that be as mild as a broken tooth. Maybe that could be a choking hazard. In that case, that could be life and death for the person who's choking on that physical hazard. You say, well, after going through all that, where else could I find a potential hazard with the raw material coming in? Google it. It's amazing what you can get if you just type in to Google food safety hazards associated with, and then say carrots or say milk powder or say whatever, and you will get quite a few reference articles that will help you. Now you have to determine, is this good information? In most cases, the answer is yes. So you have the ability even then to Google it. The point thing is you do have to do a thorough hazard analysis. Having done that hazard analysis and basically determined all the foreseeable hazards that could come from your ingredients, come from your people in the plant, and come from the environment and equipment in the plant, you now have to sit down as a team and determine the probability, the severity, and the risk. Because not all of these are going to be equally probable, not all going to have the same severity, and they're not all going to have the same risk to your consumer or to you. So you say, well, what is the probability? It's a measure of the likelihood that an event will occur. Severity is the measure of the risk to the health of the consumer. What is the risk to you? The risk is the impact on your business if the product contains a hazard of human health concern. And obviously, nobody wants to get anybody sick. You certainly don't want to finish up killing anybody. You don't want to get in trouble with regulators. And so these are things you have to do. You have to do a probability on those foreseeable hazards. You have to determine the severity if they were present, and the risk to your business if they finish up in your product going out and the consumer is going to eat the product. You say, well, what would help me determine that probability? Well, obviously, the three major factors causing recalls, allergens, salmonella, Listeria monocytogenes. If they're not included in your risk assessment, and therefore in your hazard analysis, and therefore your risk assessment, then I would say you're missing a key ingredient problem. So therefore you have to determine, is this a problem for us? Yes. If you've got allergens, if there's a potential for salmonella in any of your ingredients, and if you're making ready-to-eat products and the potential for Listeria monocytogenes could be in that ready-to-eat product. You should also consider all of those hazards that I've just listed for you that the FDA listed, that USDA listed, because again, are they applicable to you? You have to make that determination, but they are suggesting to you, you should consider these and even giving you examples of where you may find them. Obviously put in there things that you had experience with that have caused you issues, even if the product hasn't got out the door. And your suppliers have had recalls due to them. So if you're following the FDA recall list, then that's a very good place to find out who's having recalls and why, to see if that hazard could possibly one that you should have had in your hazard analysis and is missing. Do the same with the USDA recall list. Do the same with the importer lists if you're bringing in stuff from outside the United States. These are all resources for you to discover what are the hazards that are causing problems with our food supply. Do I have them covered in my hazard analysis, or can I justifiably say they're not foreseeable for my ingredients, my products? When we're talking about severity, you have to know the difference between what's going to make you sick, what's going to put you in hospital, and what's going to kill you. And as you can see, the biggest problem we have with illnesses is actually viruses. Viruses cause more than anything else. So that 5.5 actually should be viruses. Bacteria is obviously the one that's going to cause you the most hospitalizations, and deaths is going to be caused by bacteria as well. So think about that when you determine, is my problem a bacteria, a parasite, or a virus? Viruses don't generally kill you. Viruses don't generally put you in hospital. But what does happen is bacteria finishes up making you sick, puts you in hospital, and possibly kills you. So now we say, well, which of those pathogens, those bacteria, are the worst? Listeria monocytogenes is by far the worst. If that turns into listeriosis, which is the disease that some people get when they get Listeria monocytogenes in their body, and not all of us do, but those who do, 20% of them finish up dying. 60% of them finish up in hospital on IV drips trying to recover. Compare that with salmonella. That's about 1% of the people die. Botulism is about next. Obviously, if you get botulism, you're going to get paralyzed and you're going to finish up on the respirator. But if you can get on the respirator, botulism, actually you can survive it. Salmonella, and then E. coli or STEX, Shigella toxin E. coli. There's a whole group of them. If these are potential hazards, foreseeable hazards with your products, then these have to be in your hazard analysis. You have to recognize these are a severe threat to your products, and these are a severe threat to the consumer. We moved into chemicals. Allergens is certainly the bigger one of the allergens versus pesticides. People who are allergic to food allergens can finish up dying from anaphylactic shock. They can finish up having to use an EpiPen to stop themselves dying. How do they know that the allergen's in the product? Because you labeled it properly. So if you're doing a good job of having the allergens clearly labeled and avoiding cross-contact of allergens into products that are not on the label, then obviously you're controlling a serious hazard called allergens. Pesticides, as I mentioned a minute ago, is more associated with ingredients coming from outside the United States. Now, if you're not buying anything from outside the United States, maybe you can justify that pesticide is not a highly probable hazard for you. And then physical hazards go without saying. They don't usually kill people, but they do cause people to cut a gum, break a tooth, and therefore there is some liability attached to that. But make that physical hazard big enough, then you could choke somebody. The last thing you have to do when you've done probability and severity is you have to do the risk. And each company has to do this according to their own scenario. How many people are going to get sick if this hazard gets out there? How many people are going to die if this hazard gets out there? How much regulatory oversight am I going to get where the regulators are going to come in because I'm not in compliance with the law? I'm putting out a potentially hazardous product. Lawyers are coming after me. And unfortunately, the lawyers are the ones who get your money. The regulators get to possibly close you down, seize your product, make you recall it. But the lawsuits can be into the millions and millions of dollars. And last but not least, but maybe I should be the top of the list, you're not going to want to cause any harm to any consumer. It's not good for them. It's not good for you. It's not good for your business. It's not good for your publicity. So you say, well, how can I reduce these hazards? Because having determined all my foreseeable hazards, having made sure that I haven't missed any, having done the probability, the severity, and then finished up with those of the left that I know I've got a problem with if I don't control them, then I have to get to what am I going to do about them? Now I know what they are. But if you didn't come up with all your foreseeable hazards, you've already got an issue because you've missed something. But let's assume that you've done that, and now you've got all your foreseeable hazards that you believe have a high probability, have a severity, and are putting your business and the consumer at risk. Then you have three choices. You can prevent, you can eliminate, or you can reduce the hazard down to a low enough level that is not of human health concern. So you say, well, how can I do that? Well, sometimes you can't do that. Your supplier has to do that. Because if your supplier ships you something with a hazard in it and you have no heat step or you have no other means of getting rid of that hazard, then you're going to pass it straight through your plant to your finished product, to the consumer, and yet your supplier should have taken care of the problem. So you're going to rely a lot on your supplier, and that's why if you go to the Preventive Control for Human Foods, it does talk about hazards controlled by a supplier, recognizing that a lot of industries don't have the ability to control all the hazards within their own plant. But you have to make sure that these are done with valid food safety programs and are in compliance with the regulations so that you know that when you say you're getting rid of a hazard, you're doing a valid process that is shown to be effective in reducing that hazard down to a low enough level that it will no longer be a human health concern. Obviously, one of the other things, you can avoid handling risky ingredients. There are some ingredients that come with no risks. They come with more risk than other ingredients. There are some products that you make which are going to be higher risk products than others. If you want an easier life, then obviously don't handle risky products, don't handle risky ingredients, don't handle suppliers that don't have good programs, and you can reduce your risks. But that means you're going to put out basically shelf-stable products, and that may not be the type of products that you want to be making. It may be not your niche in the marketplace. So how do I prevent them getting where they're not supposed to be? Well, if I've got an allergen, and I know it's supposed to be in a product, and I know it's on the label, then life's good for me. The problem is when I don't get it off the equipment after I've used that product on the equipment or processed that product on the equipment, and then I get into allergen cross-contact. Now the allergen finishes up in a product where it's not supposed to be, and it's not on the label, and I'm into a Class 1 recall because I'm threatening the health of the consumer. This could also happen in storage. This could also happen because I put the product in the wrong package, and the product's okay. It's just that it's in a package that doesn't say the allergen's in it because I put it in the wrong package. Again, those are things where you can increase your risk because you lost control of something. Bacterial cross-contamination is similar to allergen cross-contact, except you left some bacteria on the equipment to grow and then get into the next product. Or you stored raw over ready to eat, or something in your storage areas, in your coolers. Last but not least is the concern for environmental pathogens in your packaging area, particularly when you're making a ready-to-eat product. So now you got Listeria monocytogenes, or you got Salmonella, or you got E. coli in that packaging room, and now it's floating around, and it lands on your ready-to-eat product that you made safe, and at the final stage, you contaminated it just before you put it in the package and shipped it out. So what should that room be? Extremely clean, segregated from other areas. And we're going to do a webinar on March the 1st on controlling Listeria, so I will invite you back to that one. But now you got employees working with your product at various stages. How close are they? Where are they relative to the finished product that you have made safe, and now the employees' lack of good health or lack of hygiene causes the product to get contaminated? If you say our employees are basically not in a position to touch, to cough, or in other words, affect the product, then that's good. How do you do rework? Do you rework products accurately so that you don't get an allergen-containing rework into a non-allergen product? And how do you make sure, as I said a minute ago, that you do make sure that the product is labeled correctly? All of these bring risks, yet I've looked at HACCP plans in the past, and allergen labeling was never identified as a critical control point, but it is. If you don't print the packaging correct, you already got a problem. So what can be more critical than that? If you put the product in the wrong package, what can be more critical than that? So there are many different critical control points just involving with allergens, yet most companies in the past would leave that out as and not include it as a CCP in the HACCP plan. I'm telling you, you need to. You say, well, how would I eliminate the risk? Because you said I can eliminate them, I can reduce them, I can prevent them. Well, if you can prevent them, that's the best. But what if you can't prevent them? And you can't when you're buying some ingredients. They're not going to come in free of foreseeable hazards, particularly if you're buying them and they're coming out of a field, or they're coming out of an orchard, or it's a live animal that's being slaughtered. It's going to come with some hazards. Well, if you've got a heat process, that's going to be how you get rid of it. So make sure that everything goes through that heat process, and it's a valid heat process, and it's been shown to reduce the level of bacteria down to a safe level. You could do acidification, drop the pH below 4.6, in some cases 4.4, and this will help to kill off or reduce or stop it growing a pathogen. You can add antimicrobial agents. You can do high pressure pasteurization. You can do irradiation. Now you got to be careful. Irradiation, you can only do it on products where the government said that's legal. And then remember, you got to put it on the label. And for some people, they don't want to do that. And high pressure pasteurization only works with products that can take high pressure, and it's an expensive process. But these are available to you. So how would I reduce or control? Because once I've reduced it, I got to control it so it doesn't grow again. Well, keeping things cold, having a cold plant, having cold rooms, having cold coolers, storing products in cold, shipping them cold. And if you've seen under the sanitary transportation of food now, you have to prove your product is shipped cold, stays cold all the way, and gets to the other end cold. You can freeze things. We do a lot of that. Now, remember, freezing doesn't kill bacteria or viruses. So you can't just say, I'm going to freeze a product and that'll get rid of those two hazards. It doesn't. It does kill parasites. I can dehydrate. Bacteria won't grow if I reduce the water activity. Therefore, I reduce the amount of water. Bacteria can't grow. So some companies will actually dehydrate the products, making them shelf stable. So what in summary, and then we'll take questions and answers. Make sure you do a thorough hazard analysis. And again, you can go to Preventive Controls for Human Foods, you can go to HACCP classes, you can Google, and you can get consultants, and you can get help if you need it. If you don't need it, then obviously make sure you've done a thorough hazard analysis. The FDA requires everybody now to do a hazard analysis, no matter how many products you make, how small amount of product you make, what type of products you make. Everybody has to have a hazard analysis under the FDA's Food Safety Plan. After doing that, determine your risks. There may be some risk you're willing to accept because it is not high enough risk to threaten the health of the consumer. It's not a sterile product. Most of you are not putting out sterile products, so therefore you can't say that they're free of all bacteria. What you're saying is the bacteria levels are low enough that it's safe for human consumption. But if you want to put out sterile product, then you better get into radiation, or you better get into high pressure pasteurization, or you better get into high temperature processing. Then you could basically say you're putting out a sterile product. But after you've determined your risk, you have to decide your actions. What am I going to do to make sure that the product I put out is not going to have a foreseeable hazard in it that's going to cause the consumer to get sick, cause a regulator to come after me, and cause possibly them to go get lawyers? You got to endeavor to prevent the hazard entering your plant. That would be the first thing you want to try to do, is try to stop a hazard even entering your plant. Now you say, well, what can I do there? Well, if your suppliers will do most of the hazard controls for you, then basically you're going to have very few hazards coming into your plant. That's not always possible, but if you can do that, that's one way to go. But remember, it can come in from the environment, on the air makeup systems, on the shoes of your employees, et cetera, et cetera. So you can't say that everything comes in the plant from your ingredients. It doesn't. And then once it gets in your plant and takes up residency, you got to get rid of it, particularly when it's Listeria monocytogenes and you're making a ready-to-eat product. Once you've got this HACCP plan set up and you've determined your critical control points, by definition, they have to be followed every time. It isn't like playing horseshoes where if I get close, it's okay, and if I get a ringer, that's great. Here you got to get a ringer every time. You've got to make sure that your HACCP plan has a valid process for controlling that hazard, and you can prove to a regulator or a third-party auditor when questioned that you know your process is valid. If all of that doesn't get you where you need to be, then I have only one advice for you. You need to go get help. You can get a process authority. You can get consultants. You can get some academic institutions. Remember, you can also Google, and you can get some help. We're here to help, and we can help you. The stakes are high. You can't afford to be incomplete in your HACCP plan. And then the FDA calls it a food safety plan now, but they're basically the same. They're designed to put out a safe product. So Holly, how about questions and answers and a little wrap up?
Yeah, we've got lots of questions, Dr. Bob. Let me switch back to my view here. I'm showing the same screen here, and I'm just going to read you the questions here.
Okay.
All righty. Okay. What happens if you have a very long list of, this is quite a long question, so I'm just going to try to summarize it here best I can. Sorry, my screen's a bit frozen here. That's okay. So you have a long list of ingredients, perhaps hundreds of ingredients. The well-known ones, these are easy because you can identify them usually through the FDA and the CFIA's databases. But for ones that you cannot find, sort of how do you recommend sort of tackling those? If you have hundreds of ingredients, how do you approach ingredients that are lesser known and perhaps not in those databases?
Well, one of the things, if they're not in a database, it generally means that nobody's having a problem with them, because if anybody's having a problem with them, then they will definitely be showing up in a database somewhere. They'll be showing up in an FDA recall list, a USDA recall list. They'll be showing up in some training materials, etc. So I would say don't go looking for hazards where they may not be, and that's easy for me to say. But take that as a reason to believe that there hasn't been an incident. I'll give you an example. Salmonella in peanut butter. Prior to about 2006, when I believe it was, one of the major retailers had a problem with one of the major manufacturers had a problem with salmonella in peanut butter. We never looked for salmonella in peanut butter. We always assumed it was taken care of in the roaster. Now we realize that isn't true unless you've got a very valid roasting process. So I would say to you, if you've got all those ingredients, you certainly need to look and see if there's any evidence of foreseeable hazards. And if you can't find it, then I would move on, because I have no other resources except to tell you history, and education is generally where you go to get that information.
Yeah, okay. Is it possible, the question is from Ben, is it possible to define an integrated HACCP program backwards and or towards the supply chain?
Well, yeah, that's one of the things in preventive controls for human foods is you have to look at all the hazards that could possibly be associated with your product. And if you can't take care of them, you have to go back upstream to your suppliers, and they have to take care of it. Because in the past, the FDA had shown that actually about 60% of all recalls were caused by a supplier of an ingredient to a processor, where the processor had no ability to get rid of the hazard, or they weren't even looking for it because they didn't suspect it was there, and they finished up having a recall. And so we've identified your suppliers are critical to you, and they've been asked to step up their game, and most of them have. So if that's where you were leading to with that question about going backwards to your supplier, that's what I would do it.
Yeah, and actually going on that topic, Dr. Bob, there's a number of questions that are around this. I'll give you one example. This attendee submitted the question. So they buy a spice, the vendor of that spice is now sending us the document that says basically they're declaring the responsibility, they're passing it on because they do not have the ability to control or reduce that risk.
Well, I'm going to tell you right now, that's obviously one of the things that's happening, unfortunately, right now. The supplier's trying to push it down to you. Now, you have to decide whether you're going to accept that or not. But if you don't respond to them telling you that they're pushing it to you, then by default, you just inherited that hazard. If you have no ability to get rid of it, you've got it. They told you you got it, and you didn't do anything about it to either stop buying from them or tell them, I'm not accepting you not controlling it. Now, you may say to yourself, well, they said they have no ability to control it. Well, what was in that spice mix? Was a pepper in there? Was salmonella in it? And they were buying the pepper from somebody else, and the somebody else, which is the supplier to the supplier, could have taken care of it. Then push them back to go back to their supplier of the pepper that goes into the spice mix to control it, because you have no ability to take their spice mix, use it in your product. Your product doesn't have a heat step, and now they cause you the problem. Or you've got to go to another supplier. Do not accept those letters. Certainly don't sign off on them unless you're willing to accept the hazard is now yours.
Yeah, okay. Is there a list of ready-to-eat products subject to Listeria contamination?
Well, yeah, the FDA's got a whole article, and we're going to talk about that on March the 1st. So I'm going to defer to that when we'll talk a little bit more about it. But yes, there are products that are more prone to it. There are products that are more supportive of it growing, and therefore Listeria is a big issue. But the definition of ready to eat is obviously a product that you understand the consumer is going to buy it, open up the package, eat it, and do nothing with it other than eat it.
Yeah, okay. If I have a HACCP plan that is approved by the CFIA and passed by BRC, am I covered under FSMA?
Well, that's an interesting question. The FDA has indicated that they trust the Canadian food safety system. They've said it's equal to or better than ours, but they still do require you to make sure you do comply with the FDA FSMA requirements. So that'll be up to you to make sure that whoever you're selling the product to is agreeing to that, because under the Foreign Supplier Verification Program, any product coming into the United States has to comply with the Foreign Supplier Verification Program, but which part of that is to comply with the Food Safety Modernization Act, FSMA, and it has to be an FSBP importer living in the United States who verifies that. So for the question coming from Canada, if the FSBP importer in America is saying that your plan meets the requirements of FSMA, then it's their responsibility and they will be the one held accountable by the FDA.
Okay. If the allergens are addressed in the CQPs or there's a prerequisite program, is there still a need to make the allergen control program a critical control point?
Well, actually, the FDA calls it an allergen preventive control, and to me, that's a CCP. And so the answer is it will not be allowed to be covered by a prerequisite program. It needs to be an allergen preventive control in your food safety plan, in your food safety manual, and you need to ramp it up, and you cannot cover it with a prerequisite, which you may have been doing for years with your HACCP plan.
Okay. Should the pathogens be considered even if the product will be fully cooked by the end user?
Then you're pushing the hazard down to the next person. If they'll accept that, yes. And therefore, the question is it now a ready-to-eat or a ready-to-cook product? Does the consumer understand how to cook the product? And remember, we've now got a group of consumers, unfortunately, who aren't as educated in food safety as we would want them to be. And USDA years ago started telling you what temperatures to cook the products to on meat products. The FDA has not necessarily done that with the diversity of products they got. But you have to decide the risk. If you're going to pass the hazard on to the consumer and hope they cook the product to the right temperatures, what are you going to do if they don't and they go get a lawyer, which we've had problems with, and the lawyer says you weren't quite clear on what the consumer was supposed to do? Now you're passing it on to another manufacturer because you're an ingredient supplier, and the manufacturer agrees to accept the hazard and they will take care of it. That's a different issue.
Okay. So just building on that, we have a product that is cooked then dried. The cooking eliminates the pathogen, and the product is dried to shelf-stable temperature. Is the cooling of the product after the cooking required before drying?
Well, yeah, because you're not. When you're cooking a product, you're not killing off all the bacteria. You're doing a 4-log, 5-log, 6-log reduction, but you're going to still have a small trace amount of whatever you're getting rid of. It will not grow again if you control the cooling process. So look, the FDA has cooling parameters where you have to get it down from 135 down to 70 in a couple of hours, and then from 70 down to 41 in another 4. USDA is slightly different. Theirs is bringing it down to 180, and you've got a total of 5 on. But both of them have identified that a product, even though it's safe, is not safe to allow it to cool slowly. And therefore, you could build up the bacteria again, and then drying it is not going to kill it. It's just going to stop it growing.
Okay. Let me see here. If the supplier participates in a third-party audit, a GFSI scheme, should we validate some more of the product relevant programs ourselves instead of relying on the audit report?
Well, first of all, let's talk about the audit report. Remember, the FDA says the audit report is all that you need, but I would make sure it's being done by a qualified auditor, which means the auditor has to go through the PCQI training, which is what I recommend early on in this thing that all of you go through. And therefore, make sure it's being done by a qualified auditor. And then it's up to you whether you want to verify some of the things in the audit. I would make sure, one, you get the audit, two, you get a certificate from the auditor saying that they have been trained and therefore a qualified auditor. I would get a copy of the nonconformities, corrective actions, and not just the audit report. You want to know what they did about the problems. And then after that, it's up to you to risk assess, do I still have everything I need? And if you're asking for a COA, I would get the lab analysis directly from the lab to you with the permission of your supplier so that you know that the lab analysis didn't somehow get changed.
Okay. At what point or how do you determine when to elevate a prerequisite program to a CCP?
Well, then the FDA has helped you with that. They've basically told you that allergen preventive controls are going to be elevated. So they've told you that the sanitation, particularly in a packaging area for ready to eat, is being elevated. And they've also told you you have to elevate your approved supplier program when you've got a supplier who has to control a hazard for you. So I think the FDA has helped you with those. How many else after that you want to elevate? It's up to you based on that risk to your business and to the consumer.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Let's see here. Is a HACCP plan required under FSMA for a grape and stone fruit cold storage warehouse with no packing operations performed?
Okay, so that was a warehouse, and the question was, again, just read the first part of the question again for me.
Yeah, is a HACCP plan required under FSMA for a grape and stone fruit cold storage warehouse with no packing operations?
If that's a shelf-stable product, the answer would be that if it's totally packaged and protected, the answer would be no, because FSMA exempts everybody from things. But produce, if it's in a container where it can be exposed to the environment or exposed to the workers, then they have to have a HACCP plan. If it's a refrigerated product, and then they have to have a HACCP plan to the degree that everything has to come in cold, stay cold, and go out cold. But I suspect that the product you're talking about is shelf-stable, and it sounds like it's been processed and it's got a high sugar content. And so it's most likely shelf-stable, and you maybe only store it refrigerated if you store it refrigerated just for a quality reason.
Okay. If the products don't have it,
sorry, I'm sorry, Holly. If I didn't answer that question properly, send us an email, and I'll try to answer it better if I didn't quite understand the question.
Yeah, absolutely. If the products don't have any free of claims, quote unquote, on their labels about allergens, is an allergen risk analysis and or a program necessary under FSMA?
Well, if you don't have any allergens, you don't have to obviously meet the allergen preventive controls. But if you have allergens, even if you've got only one allergen, then it clearly has to be on the label, and it clearly has to be in terms that the average person on the street would understand, like milk, instead of saying things like sodium caseinate. So unless you don't have any allergens at all, yes, there would still be an allergen preventive control called labeling.
Okay. How can we control in a supplier approval program for alcoholic ingredients when it's from a different country, so outside of the Americas region?
Alcoholic ingredient, well, and that's one of the ones that's exempt is alcohol and ingredients for alcohol. So unless you're being more specific about something there, the word alcohol generally gets your exemption.
Okay. So Liz, feel free to send a follow-up question if you haven't answered there. That's great. Thanks, Dr. Bob. Yeah, so another question, do domestic wineries need a HACCP plan? So that answers that question as well. Let me see here. The FDA Food Safety Program asks to control internal sabotage. Can you please give some hints on how to control that and how to show that we have control in place?
Well, we'll talk about food defense. We do training on that. We have done a webinar that, again, if you come back to us, Holly can give you a link to a webinar we've done on that. But you do have to protect your products against sabotage by your own employees, and unfortunately, that is a realistic threat. It isn't part, though, of what we talked about today. It would not be part of your food safety plan. It wouldn't be part of a HACCP plan. It would be part of your food defense plan. And remember, by 2019, April, only a year away now, every one of you is going to have a fully written food defense plan that includes vulnerability assessments, mitigation steps, corrective actions, monitoring, et cetera, and training of your employees.
Yeah, okay. So for folks, there's a few questions coming in. So we just recently did over the last few months a couple of webinars, one on supply chain traceability. We did one on food defense. So I'll include in a follow-up email along with the recording and the slide deck from today's presentation, a couple of links to those on-demand webinars. They're free in case you missed them as well. So just to answer those questions. From Lynn, if you have a distribution facility that repackages your products into smaller packaging, do they, like the distribution facility, do they need a GFSI certification?
Well, nobody needs a GFSI certification. That's up to you. And sometimes it's not up to you because your customer says you've got to have it. So don't confuse GFSI, which is voluntary, versus FDA, which is mandatory. And then the question comes, are you just repacking already enclosed products? If you are, then there's very little you have to do about the health and hygiene of employees or the environment, etc. But if you've got exposed products, then you're coming right under the full FSMA. You've got to do all the things that we've just talked about and have a HACCP plan, etc.
Yeah, okay. What is the risk profile of freeze-dried herbs used by customers, manufacturers, in ready-to-eat products, such as dips?
Well, that's an interesting question because freeze-dried herbs, the question is, are they loaded with pesticide? That would be one of the first things that I would say. Do they have any heavy metal contamination that would have come out of the soil in which they were grown? Because we're finding things like arsenic in apples, and we're finding lead in carrots, and we're finding stuff because of the contaminated environment in which some things are grown. So I would think about those, and those are things you're not going to be able to remove because you can't get rid of pesticides or heavy metals out of those herbs. So I would make sure you're getting those analyzed. The question is freeze-dried with low bacterial levels, or freeze-dried when they had high bacterial levels, and freeze-drying isn't going to kill the bacteria. It's just still going to be there, and then somebody's going to add water to that product, and all of a sudden that bacteria is going to be able to grow again.
Okay. How would allergens be applicable for food packaging companies?
Well, interesting question. The government has actually been able to show a few documented cases where allergens in a food packaging plant contaminated the packaging and then contaminated the product and caused a Class 1 recall. And sometimes it's in the ink that's actually printed on one side of the packaging and then gets onto another. And there are a couple of incidences of that as well, when in the rest of the world, packaging has caused a problem. Very little problem, minor problem, but not a problem that is a zero problem.
Okay. Can you exclude radiological hazards if there is no reason to worry about that? In other words, can you add a sentence to exempt that portion?
Yes. All the FDA is asking you to do is consider it, and then with probability being low, you can dismiss it, but I wouldn't do that if you lived in the Central Valley of California, where the water level got so low in the previous drought, which is over right now, but could come back, and they were actually leaching uranium out of the soil in water coming out of wells. Or if you live right by a nuclear power station that could be hit by a tsunami, and you go, oh, well, is that going to happen? Hopefully not, but it did in Japan. And so the question for most people is radiological hazards are going to be highly improbable. Therefore, you're going to risk assess them away. And but you can't say they're not likely to happen in all circumstances.
Okay. I think the last question for today here, let's have a look. Two questions. I see the USDA HACCP generic program that is dry fermented are cooked. That dry fermented are cooked and then straight to drying. So how will the cooling fit into this?
Okay, that was talking about USDA, was talking about fermented products. I imagine something like salami or something like that. And then the question went on to say,
Yep, so she's just commented, I see the USDA HACCP generic program that dry fermented are cooked and then straight to drying. So how does the cooling fit into this? I think she might have left out a word there. I apologize. Liz, if you want to send me a follow-up question, we'll readdress that question.
Yeah, I think we need a little bit more on that one because you're going to control, obviously, the product there with fermentation and cooking, by the sounds of it. Some products don't even have a heat step. They're controlled totally by fermentation. And so cooking with cooling would be different than fermentation with no cooking. So I need to get a little bit more on that question.
Yeah, that's okay. Liz, if you want to just follow, like I say, that up with a question there. Okay, last question regarding allergens. Is dry, quote unquote, cleaning or vacuum brushing a real thing? So for dry environments, for example, dry pet foods or ready to eat where water cannot be used, but there are a lot of crevices, so a conveyor belt, metal detector, that sort of thing. What's been your experience, Dr. Bob? What's the best way to completely clean or remove any allergens from those kinds of surfaces, environments, equipment?
Well, it's a challenge, but I think wet cleaning is also a challenge. The proof of the pudding, as they say, is in taking your allergen swabs and being able to swab and show that after you follow an approved cleaning process, that there are no allergens left. That's about the only way you could say whether that's dry cleaning or wet cleaning. If you can't find the allergen on the equipment, your cleaning program is effective. If you can find it, your cleaning program is not effective.
Okay. All right, we just got two more questions that just came in. We have a few more minutes here from Yolanda. We use some composable packaging materials which may be made from some allergens, but our products, our foods, are allergen-free. Do we need any allergen statement?
Go back on I was listening to the first part about packaging.
Yeah, we use
packaging.
Yeah, some composable packaging materials which may be made from some allergens. So there's a possibility that the packaging is made from allergens, but the products are allergen free. So the question is, does there need to be an allergen statement?
Well, yeah, because if you think that there's a incidental contact and the allergen could get from the packaging into the product, the answer would be yes. Now, whether you're going to put made in a plant that also handles packaging materials that could contain allergens, but if you really think the allergen's getting into the product, then you have to label it as the allergen being in the product. So be real careful with that one, because it sounds like you're in danger of getting an allergen into a product and then not having it clearly stated on the label. And remember, the FDA has no threshold at all. Any allergen in any product at any level that is not on the label is a class 1 recall, and your product's coming back, even if it came from the packaging materials that you are using in the plant at some stage.
Okay. Going from an organic product to a non-organic product, does the mixer have to get a full and complete wash?
Now you're mixing organic versus food safety. FDA has no jurisdiction in food safety. Your question would have to be directed to an organic certifying body, of which we are not, nor am I.
Okay. Also, Liz has just sent clarification for the previous question on the dry fermented product. So yes, the product is a dry fermented product where it is cooked after fermentation. The product is sent for drying after cooking. In the previous question, you had mentioned that cooling is needed right after cooking.
Yeah, basically, if that's a USDA product, USDA does require products that are cooked, where you're removing a pathogen with the cooking process. Now, the question is, were you removing it with a fermentation process? And so why were you cooking it? Were you cooking it purely for quality versus you're cooking it for food safety then if you were cooking it for food safety, then you're trying to get rid of something that the fermentation didn't get rid of. And now if you don't get rid of it all, which you won't by cooking, you'll get it down to low enough levels, it could grow again unless you cool it real well. Again, a question that you may want, well, if you're doing it, you got a USDA inspector in your plans, then I would say then it must be okay, because the USDA guy wouldn't allow you to be doing it. If it's not a meat product and you're talking about something else, you're talking about an FDA regulated product, then the question would be, what are you trying to control with the cook step? If you'll give me that information, we can talk a little bit more.
Okay, very good. That's the last question for today. Dr. Bob, thank you very much for your presentation. Thanks to everyone for attending. A reminder, we've recorded today's webinar. We'll send the link to the recording as well as the slide deck within a few business days. And with that, wish you a wonderful day. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.